Hello. So I was actually going to open with a joke. It was about pointless, but and that's okay. That's totally cool. I figure we've had enough laughs about pointless. Actually, interestingly enough, I noticed. So when I was thinking like, what joke can I open with? I kind of noticed that DDD, which I've prepended my talk title here with, is kind of a little bit of a pun in and of itself. So if anyone's familiar with the term TDD, test-driven development, this pun, which I can't take credit for, means docs-driven development. So it's a term we're kind of trying to coin a little bit here. What I want to talk to you today about is writing the docs before the API. I work for a company called Onfido. So our headquarters is in London. Our vision is to create an open world where identity is the key to access. So we're very much in the RegTech IDV space. And so in terms of our developer hub, we have an API consisting of RESTful endpoints. We have API reference documentation, which kind of doubles as product documentation. That's based on Slate, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. We also have quick start guides. We have a Postman collection. We have client libraries in various languages to interact with our API. And we have web, JavaScript, iOS, and Android SDKs, which are all hosted on GitHub. So in terms of the users of our existing developer hub, we have software engineers, developers. We also have technical program managers and service managers and product managers. Those are kind of who we've narrowed down to our main users. So this is kind of like a snapshot of this Slate-based documentation instance, which we have currently live for our V2 of our API. Some of you who are eagle-eyed might notice in the top left of your screens, I think, there's actually a version switcher, which is one of the cool things which we have in our Slate instance, which is something which is highly requested on the Slate GitHub page, but which isn't available as standard. And that actually reminds me, I forgot to mention, before I go on, I should say that my talk today, whilst I guess it does touch upon relatively technical concepts, I'm trying to tell a story about something we did at Onfido, and trying to frame that in terms of kind of how successful we were conceptually. So hopefully, even though it is something which touches upon quite technical concepts, even if you're not familiar with those, it should still, I hope, come across that it's about the story. So this is our developer hub documentation in a bit more detail. These are our quick start guides based on Gatsby. And as I mentioned, we have a Postman collection, which you can use to interact with our API. So the project, so this is why I'm here today. So basically, when I joined Onfido a few months back, so one of the things that the product manager and my team spoke to me about was designing a new API. So he talked to me. He said, "Look, you've done a bit in this space. So would you be interested in getting involved in kind of a more design-like project?" And so we had this idea about, which I'll come to in a moment in more detail, about docs-driven development. And at the start, we just kind of had a wish list of what we wanted for API v3. So we thought we'll start with doing some research into what users are struggling with our current API v2. So we looked at the pain points for that version. We wanted to make improvements to the user experience rather than make this about kind of a step change, meaning a big change. And we wanted to be able to release this when it was ready. And obviously, we also wanted to have peripheral aspects, such as the client libraries from OpenAPI, such as our Postman collection, available. So we wanted to look at this as kind of like a holistic developer experience project. So in order to kind of identify some of the V2 pain points, we talked to product support and sales engineers who are very close to our customers. We looked at API logs. We looked at support tickets. So we did kind of like a deep dive into these areas to try to figure out where customers were struggling with different parts of the whole experience. We had some ideas. I had some ideas myself about things they might be struggling with, but there's only so much you can anticipate. And we did find some really interesting points about the things which they were having trouble with. Ultimately, what we wanted to do when we kind of got a better idea about the sorts of things they were struggling with was to make things simpler. So one part of that, to kind of go down into the nitty-gritty a little bit, was to make the endpoint structure simpler to understand, more consistent. and better matching to what people expected from kind of like the words used. We wanted to look at request bodies, so simplifying those. Some of the users that we had, quite a few in fact, were struggling with passing the wrong information, and that we could. There's many reasons that might be, but we figured the simpler we can make it, the less likely they are to have those sorts of problems. And as I've kind of already touched upon, one of the key things was trying to make the actual default behavior closer to what users what they expect, and what we can try to figure out what they expect from our deep dive. So I'm just going to take an aside for a moment and ask the question, so should you involve technical writers from the start of a project? And I can only really draw on my own personal experience when I'm talking about this. I'm sure, as I've had the pleasure of speaking to many of you already, I think some people have had very similar experiences to my own, but I should caveat this, that this is based on my own personal experience. Maybe you've heard these sorts of things. You don't have an API if you don't have documentation. It needs to have documentation to be feature complete. To many of us, I'm sure this is self-evident. But it isn't always, and I'll start with disadvantages. Maybe this is controversial, but it isn't always so simple. So projects change, sometimes quite dramatically. So if you're involved as a tech writer from the beginning of a project, you may find that a lot of your work ends up being what I might describe as sunk costs. So some of the stuff which you've done is no longer relevant because the product has changed so extensively because of design choices, which is natural. Obviously, I think many of us have experienced this skepticism about value of dedicated docs writers. There can be differing expectations in terms of what the tech writer wants to achieve, what they feel they can add, and what the team feels like the tech writer should be responsible for. And obviously, developers, when they're starting a new project, when they're involved in that, they're very, very engaged with designing the actual product itself, and that might limit the amount of time that tech writer can actually have with those developers. But some advantages of this, so content debt, by which I mean kind of the idea that you might release something without describing it very well in your UX content or DX content, such as docs. So content debt is not really an issue if you have tech writers from the start, in theory, in my experience. Tech writers do tend to be closer to other parts of the business or organization. Tech writers do tend to have a better sense of user or developer expectations, and they do tend to be very good at establishing consistency within content design and design as a whole. So back to my why I'm here today, so the docs-driven development idea, and trying to tie this all together. So the original idea we had, broadly speaking, the idea was, shall we document an ideal documentation instance for API v3, and then before we actually make that, and then ask people for feedback. That kind of evolved, as we talked about it more, into let's stagger our ideal changes to those API docs, to that instance, and then ask for feedback that way. So I'll touch upon how we did that in more detail as I go on, but that kind of is what the idea became. So as I mentioned, this is the first time we tried anything like this at Onfido, certainly the first time I've tried anything like this in my own experience. There were 2 people involved in the project, one of whom was me, and we established responsibilities from the outset. So Alan Carey, my colleague in this, he was responsible for the actual development of the API and reviewing much of what I did. And I was responsible for the documentation itself, setting up the instance and the technical side of that, the Open API spec, and our Postman collection. So we had some crossover, but those, broadly speaking, were kind of our responsibilities. So this is me in a past life, and that's Alan on the other side. We had weekly meetings to discuss these changes. So the first thing we needed to do, obviously, was establish an actual docs instance. So I'll talk about that in a moment, but that was very, very key to this. And then what we wanted to do, we decided, was open this up, as I said, for feedback in what we called time windows. So we'd kind of open up this whole thing, we'd open up the instance, ask people for feedback over, say, a week, and then make some changes to the API and go back. And then we'd make changes to the API itself after those windows closed. Our team, we work in an agile environment, so developer experience tickets or docs tickets are part of our 2-week sprint. I'm involved in that, obviously. And so tech writing sits as part of the product organization within our company, but I very much work closely with the devs. And we do have a docs as code approach, which to many I'm sure by now is obvious. So the fun part, so how really did we do this? How did we actually establish this instance? So before I came to write the docs, this is my first time here, many people commented that I only had one sticker on my laptop, and it was a GitLab sticker. I don't work for GitLab. I really like GitLab, and it absolutely wouldn't have been possible. This whole project would not have been possible without it for us. And the reason for that is because of GitLab CI. Now, I'm absolutely certain that there are alternative ways of managing a project like this, but GitLab CI for us made things enormously easy. So we migrated from a Bitbucket Jenkins setup to using GitLab and GitLab CI. For those of you who don't know, by CI, I mean continuous integration. I won't go into too much detail about what exactly that is, because simply speaking, it's not really relevant beyond to say that it allowed us, technically speaking, to set up this instance and to establish this workflow. So I've mentioned we use Slate, so we established a repository on our GitLab instance, our GitLab infrastructure, I should say, for the Slate docs. CI is built into the setup. We opened a new branch for version 3. And then as part of the whole instance, part of the whole setup, we got access to GitLab's so-called review apps functionality. So as we made changes to the Slate instance for v3, the entire instance, the entire documentation, the entire static page was deployed within minutes, and it was super, super fast. So the actual workflow, going further down into it, so what we would do is we would push changes. So we would push changes we are proposing for API v3 to the docs branch. Those would be deployed almost immediately to an internal domain, and then we'd advertise the review apps deployment, so the website, on our Slack instance internally, that we'd ask for feedback. And then as part of our agile workflow, we would make changes to things like the API, things like the Open API spec and the Postman collection, and then we'd repeat that. So the idea was we started with the docs instance, we proposed changes, and then it was kind of like a loop. So on the left here, you'll see the V2 documentation. So this is just a snippet from V2. You might be able to appreciate that the endpoint structure there right at the top is a lot longer than it is on the right. These two things are doing exactly the same thing. So one's V2 and one's V3. And you can see that the request body is much, much, much simpler. So what an example of what we might have done here is we would post what we're proposing to do for V3, and people would see this kind of thing, and then they would say, oh, this is great, or oh, this isn't what I expected, or something like that. And I'll talk about what feedback we had in a moment, but essentially that was the idea. So the feedback that we've had, so some of the quotes, so this is much better than alternative ways of doing it. It's really easy to keep track of changes. Some of the possibly qualified feedback we had, great, but it's hard to see the exact changes at times. And the reason for that, as I've already mentioned, is because each time we did this, deploying the entire instance. And we do have, if you go on our website, we do have quite a long documentation, single page. And another one, very good, but I'm already so familiar with this that it's really easy for me. It may not be easy for other people. So we've also done user research now that we're at that point where we're nearly at release stage. And we've done this so far only on internal new joiners. We get a lot of those. We focused on the usability of the V3 experience, as it were. What we found, and I'm very wary of drawing too broad conclusions from the research we've done so far, but it seems like there's a very clear line between people who really like using docs, which is great, but there are some who have barely even used it and who've seen that we offer this Postman collection inside the new V3 instance and said, oh great, I'll just go straight on that, and they've just gone away. So that validates our approach to look at this holistically and to not just look at this as a docs thing, but to look at this as an overall kind of developer experience thing, and to try to cater to as many people as possible. And one of the great side effects, one of the great things about doing user research on this was that because Alan and I guess, were so close to this project, we missed certain things which were really obvious. So things that people were struggling with from the outset. So it was really, really good right from the beginning just to see that. And it was so clear that we needed to make those changes. So in terms of conclusions, in terms of what we learned from doing all this, so far, overall, I would say it's been a success. I think it's been, in terms of the feedback we've had, in terms of how the project has run, in terms of how the API is now working. And I would also say that the whole GitLab and review apps feature that I've talked about has been really, really useful, not just for this project, but for opening up the whole process of kind of letting people who in the company who might be less comfortable using an actual GitLab interface, it's allowed them to get more involved in giving feedback. So there are lots of people who are kind of invested in this process, but who, for example, don't like going on a merge request, or in GitLab parlance, you may be more familiar with the term pull request, but they don't like going on that. And so this is a great way to just show them an actual website internally and say, look, this is something we've changed. How do you feel about this? And this whole process has been so useful for us as much as for anybody else. Pluses, so the docs are ready to go in the APIs, that's fantastic. Content debt, very, very similar to that, is not an issue. So it's also been far easier to manage aspects of this whole project, such as Open APIs, such as Postman, and it's allowed us to kind of, as I've touched upon quite a few times, it's allowed us to focus on being API designers. It's allowed us to focus on the whole experience. And it's really helped us to put kind of things in perspective that way. Some of the less positive things, so engagement is still as hard as ever. So despite us working very hard to produce this thing, it's still a challenge to get people involved in giving feedback. And I think it's understandable people have their day jobs to worry about, but it has been positive what feedback we've had, as I've said. One of the really, actually, genuinely quite hard things for me personally from this project has been that it's been very hard to maintain our existing V2 instance at the same time as working on V3. Because every time something substantial has come in that I've needed to change in V2, being the only writer, being the only person responsible for that, it's meant that I've essentially had to change it twice. So that has been a challenge. Sometimes needing to describe changes, that is quite challenging. And I touched upon some of the feedback we had in a quote. I think that's kind of unavoidable with something like this, perhaps. That in itself wasn't necessarily a problem. Sometimes when we advertised this, for instance, we just kind of said to people, look, this is the new instance, this is the preview instance, let us know what you think. And then we just kind of gave a breakdown of the really important things as we saw them. And I guess I've said this is a minus, this last one, maybe it's not so much, but we relied on our existing Slate instance, to which we essentially just added a V3. Being stable enough. And I mean, we relied on it being stable enough to support all the new things we were doing. So we had to repeatedly test that. But for example, we've not really been able to test it on mobile very easily because it's harder to access the VPN. So we are, to a certain extent, we are still relying on our Slate instance being stable enough. So the next steps, actually, as well as releasing API v3 itself, we are also doing a complete design makeover of all of our developer hub documentation. So we won't any longer rely on Slate. One of the things we want to look at is GitLab's visual reviews functionality, which is kind of an extension of the review apps feature. And what that should, in theory, allow us to do is not only give people the opportunity to look at a website, look at an instance of something, but also actually let them make comments in the form of annotations, which could be really genuinely quite game-changing. But I have to admit, I'm yet to look into that. So I'm not 100% sure, but for me, it is potentially very exciting. And another next step, lots more user research, lots more work into this before we release, but we're definitely getting there. And finally, to go back to kind of like the personal aspect of this for me, so I feel like I've had quite a, I guess, circuitous, so I've had quite a roundabout way to become a tech writer. And it's been hugely instructive for me to learn about things like Open API, learning about testing in different languages. I mean, I had always been one of those people who'd gone on different coding tutorial things and on Google or whatever, and picked up bits and pieces in lots of different languages, but never felt like an expert in any. And this has been a really good chance to just actually get out there and test something real and apply it. And I can say to the point now where I can actually talk about how Java was a really fussy language to test things in. I won't talk about why, but basically, if you're testing an Open API spec, make sure that you test it in Java. Don't rely on it working in Python, because Python is extremely permissive compared to Java in terms of looking at types. And I've obviously learned about GitLab CI, which has been fantastic. So to go back to this question that I asked at the beginning, so should you involve tech crisis from the start? So I think the key thing really, and maybe this is self-evident, but I think it really does depend on the project and the people. In our case at Onfido for our API v3 project, it was absolutely brilliant. I think it worked really well because if I'm to narrow it down, I would say we have a very strong and helpful review culture internally, so people are always happy to give feedback. We had an agile workflow, so we could chop and change things as needed. And we really did have quite great investment in the project from all across tech, product, and everyone. I would say if I was to advise someone embarking on a similar journey with something like this, I would say just plan carefully and don't, as writers, if you are afraid of new tech, just try not to be, because it's very, very hard to break something if you're working in the kind of docs as code approach that we have. And if your company doesn't facilitate this kind of experiment for you, then there are plenty of ways in which you can go off and you can contribute to open source projects and better yourself that way and get involved in, really cool, exciting stuff. And I'll be around for the rest of today and tomorrow if anyone wants to chat about some of those, or my own experiences and how I might help. But I really, really, really would strongly encourage you just not be afraid of this stuff, because it's so often much less complicated than you think. Just a quick thanks to Min, my PM on this, on our team and on this project, and the rest of the Onfido Experience team who might be streaming this. So, hey guys, and thank you for listening. That's it.